Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey into the past, into a life that most people would rather forget. Picture it. The air is thick, the city is crowded, and every corner is teeming with life. And rats. You're standing on the edge of the town. The smell of decay and old wood mixing with the ever-present stench of filth. You've got your tools in hand, and you know what's coming. Another day spent in the shadows, doing a job that nobody else wants. It's time to go to work as a medieval rat catcher. You probably won't survive this job. Not if you weren't ready for the chaos that it comes with. Rats are everywhere. You can't escape them. And without you, the town would collapse under the weight of its own rodent infestation. But before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from and when you're tuning in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's take a look at what it was really like to be a rat catcher in the medieval world. A job that, while essential, was not exactly glamorous. Your day starts early. The sound of rats squeaking and scurrying through the dark alleys is your wake-up call. There's no snooze button in this line of work. You step out into the murky streets, and your nose is instantly assaulted by the smells of the city. The air is thick with the stench of waste, bodies, and rot. Medieval towns are crowded, unsanitary places, and the rats thrive in every corner, every shadow. They're not just annoying little pests. They're a serious problem. And you, the rat catcher, are the one who has to deal with them. The role of a rat catcher isn't exactly a prestigious one. It's not like you're out there fighting battles or running businesses. No, your job is to keep the streets clear of rodents' disease spreading. Filthy rats that are a constant threat to the town's health. But despite the critical nature of your job, it's not a glamorous position. You're not going to get any fancy titles or recognition. Instead, you're likely to be greeted with suspicion, a bit of fear, and more than a little disgust. Historians still argue whether the role of a rat catcher was ever truly respected, or if it was always seen as a necessary evil. Some suggest that the job was vital for public health, especially during times when the threat of disease was so real. Others point out that it was a job filled with stigma, something that no one wanted to do, even though everyone relied on it. Either way, you're out there with your spud and your traps, ready to do what no one else will. So, you head out into the streets, knowing that your day will be filled with dangerous rats, diseases, and a job that most people would avoid at all costs. But that's your life now. You're the one who keeps the city from sinking into chaos. Even if no one wants to acknowledge it, you trudge through the muck, the rats at your heels. And you know that the job never really ends. There will always be more rats to catch, more filth to clean, and more danger lurking in the shadows. In the midst of it all, you start to realize something. You're not just dealing with rats. You're dealing with society's problems, the things everyone else is too busy to think about. You're the one who's cleaning up after the messes that no one else wants to face. And maybe, just maybe, that's why no one really acknowledges you. You're necessary, but invisible. You're the one doing the dirty work, but you'll never get the credit you deserve. So, what does it actually mean to be a medieval rat catcher? It's more than just chasing down rodents with your trusty spade. It's about being a critical cog in a much larger system, one that revolves around the ever-present threat of disease and the survival of the town. Your job is grim, yes, but it's one that no one else wants to do. You are the one who keeps the rodents in check, preventing them from taking over the city. But while your work is vital, it's also a thankless one. The medieval cities you roam through are nothing like the sanitary places we live in today. Imagine a town crowded with people, animals, and garbage, where waste is dumped into the streets or into cesspits that rarely get emptied. This creates the perfect breeding ground for rats. They thrive in these unsanitary conditions, and their population explodes faster than anyone can manage. And that's where you come in. You may not have a title, and you certainly won't be getting invited to any feasts. But without you, the town would be overtaken by these creatures. Historians still argue about the scale of the rat problem in medieval times. Some suggest that rats were as much a part of everyday life as people, constantly scurrying through the streets and homes, while others claim that their infestation was far less widespread than we think. But one thing is certain: the rats weren't just a nuisance. They were a real threat. Rats brought fleas, and fleas brought disease. The Black Death itself, one of the most catastrophic pandemics in history, is believed to have spread rapidly thanks to the rats, whose fleas were carrying the deadly bacteria. The very pests you were after were linked to a death toll that wiped out millions across Europe. In a world with little understanding of how disease spread, you were on the front lines, trying to contain the damage. Let's talk about your tools. Most people would probably expect you to have a fancy kit for catching rats, but nope. Medieval rat catchers didn't have high-tech traps or gloves to protect themselves. Your tools were simple: a spade, a bucket, maybe some homemade traps. Nothing glamorous. You would walk the streets with your spade, poking into dark corners, under buildings, and inside piles of waste where rats were likely nesting. Every time you entered one of these areas, you risked being bitten, scratched, or exposed to diseases carried by the rats. But you had no choice. The town depended on you. You weren't just fighting rats. You were fighting disease and the chaos that came with it. One of the biggest challenges: the rats were smart. They knew how to hide in places where you couldn't reach, and they reproduced faster than you could catch them. Every time you thought you had a handle on the problem, more rats would appear, more babies would be born, and the infestation would continue. You'd set traps, but sometimes it felt like the rats were a step ahead. Imagine walking through the streets, feeling like you're always 2 steps behind in a never-ending battle against these clever creatures. But it wasn't just the rats you were up against. The public perception of your job made it even worse. The town needed you, yes, but they didn't want you. As a rat catcher, you were relegated to the lowest rungs of society, along with the other unsavory jobs like garbage collectors and the gong farmers who cleaned up human waste. The reality was simple. While society couldn't function without you, they didn't want to get their hands dirty or acknowledge the work you did. People didn't want to be seen with the rat catcher. They didn't want to be reminded that the town was crawling with disease-carrying pests, and yet there you were, doing the work that no one else had the stomach for. Historians still argue over how much medieval people knew about hygiene and the dangers posed by rats. Some argue that the fear of disease was palpable. People knew that rats were carrying something dangerous, but didn't know how to fight it. Others suggest that the real problem was the lack of effective solutions. Cities had no organized waste management systems, no public health policies, and certainly no understanding of what we now call public sanitation. And so, the rat catcher became one of the only lines of defense between the public and an impending health crisis. Your job was essential, but no one appreciated it. People preferred to look away, pretend they didn't know what was really going on, and hope the rats would eventually go away on their own. And yet, despite all the stigma, despite the danger and the low social status, you still kept at it. Why? Because it was your job. It was how you survived, how you kept a roof over your head and food on the table. The work didn't stop when you got sick, when the rats kept breeding, or when the people around you turned their backs. You had to keep going, day after day, even though it was dirty, dangerous, and thankless. But here's the thing, no matter how grim the job was, it kept the community alive. Without you, the plague and other diseases would have spread even faster. You were the invisible hero, the one who kept the town from descending into total chaos. You may have been a rat catcher, but without you, society itself would have crumbled. As you continue your work as a rat catcher, the weight of your role begins to settle in. It's not just a job. It's a constant fight. Each day, you enter into the battle zone that is the medieval city, armed with nothing more than a spade, some traps, and the hope that you can keep the population from being overwhelmed by rats. And the more you work, the more you realize that this job is never done. The rats are relentless, and your efforts to keep them at bay are always in danger of being undone. You're not just battling rats, you're battling an invisible enemy, disease. Medieval towns were a breeding ground for illnesses, and rats, with their fleas, were major culprits. They scurried through the streets, carrying fleas that spread the deadly bacteria that caused the plague. It wasn't enough to simply catch the rats. You had to deal with the consequences of their presence. 2. Every rat you captured was a small victory, but it was only part of the solution. The real battle was about stopping the spread of disease. And the rats were only one piece of the puzzle. The threat of disease wasn't limited to the rats themselves. You had to be careful where you worked, how long you stayed in the areas where the rats lived, and even who you came into contact with. There was no way to know whether the person next to you had been infected by the same fleas that clung to the rats you were catching. Medieval people had no concept of germs or bacteria. They didn't understand the invisible dangers lurking all around them. You, however, were in the thick of it, constantly exposed to the very diseases you were trying to prevent. Historians still argue about the true cause of the Black Death and whether rats were solely to blame. Some argue that the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes plague, was spread by fleas that lived on the rats. Others suggest that human-to-human transmission may have played a larger role in the plague's spread. Regardless, you were out there, in the middle of it, working with the rats, exposed to the very things that could bring death to you and your entire community. But there was another danger. You faced one that most people rarely think about when they imagine the life of a rat catcher. Injury. It wasn't just the rats that posed a threat to your safety. It was also the tools you used. A spade may seem like a simple tool, but in your hands, it became a weapon. You had to be fast, sharp, and always alert. But sometimes accidents happened. A misstep, a slip of the hand, or even a misplaced foot could send you tumbling into a cesspit or a pile of filth. And worse, if you weren't careful, you could end up with a rat bite. Something that could quickly lead to an infection, potentially fatal, in a time with no antibiotics or medical knowledge. But that wasn't the worst part of the job. The worst part was the mental toll it took. You were constantly surrounded by filth. You spent your days in dark corners, under buildings, in alleys, doing work that no one wanted to talk about. You were invisible. People didn't want to see you, didn't want to hear about what you did. You were the unsung hero. Except you were never even acknowledged as a hero. You were the one who kept the town from being overrun by disease. But you didn't get a single word of thanks. You were the person people feared and avoided. But without you, the very town they lived in would have descended into chaos. Historians still debate how medieval society viewed workers like you. Some claim that the stigma of working with filth and disease made your job a source of deep shame. Others argue that people knew your work was essential, but the fear of disease and the repulsion towards your job overshadowed any gratitude that might have been felt. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Yes, people needed you, but no one wanted to acknowledge you. They just wanted you to get rid of the rats and disappear. And here's the kicker. It wasn't just rats that you were fighting. You were fighting against the way people thought about your job. They didn't want to think about how their homes and streets would be crawling with disease if you weren't around. They didn't want to recognize that without you, they wouldn't be able to live in the comfort of their clean homes, safe from disease. They didn't want to think about the ugly, unpleasant parts of life, but you were there, handling all the things no one else wanted to deal with, making sure that the town remained safe. even though no one could see it. You were doing essential work, but you were never going to be celebrated for it. The irony of your position was clear. You kept people alive, but you would never be seen as anything more than the person who handled the filth. And that's why your job sucked. It wasn't just dirty. It was lonely. You were out there every day, risking your life. And for what? A small bit of pay, a thankless role, and a society that would rather pretend you didn't exist. Now that we've discussed the physical toll of your work as a rat catcher, let's take a step back and consider the broader context of your role in society. What did it really mean to be a rat catcher in medieval times, especially when the job itself seemed so invisible? Sure, people needed you, but they were also terrified of what you represented: the filth, the disease, and the underlying chaos of the medieval world. People didn't want to acknowledge the fact that without workers like you, the whole town would be at risk. But let's be clear about something. You weren't just catching rats. You were dealing with the very essence of urban life at the time. Towns in the medieval period were often overcrowded, unsanitary places, with waste piling up in the streets and little to no system for managing it. And it wasn't just rats that you were after. No, rats were only one part of a much larger ecosystem of pests and problems. While you may have been the one running after rats with your spade, you were also managing a public health crisis that no one else knew how to handle. Historians still debate the role of the rat catcher in medieval society. Some argue that you were seen as a necessary part of the urban infrastructure, a key player in keeping the town from devolving into utter chaos. Others believe that your role was misunderstood and that the social stigma of dealing with rats and disease made you an outcast. Despite your critical importance, either way, you were out there in the trenches, doing the work that no one else would. And while people relied on you to keep the rats at bay, they didn't want to see you or acknowledge the fact that their lives depended on your grim work. As a rat catcher, you were often alone. The job itself was isolating, literally. You were out in the streets, chasing rats through dark alleys, under buildings, and through the cesspits. You were the one who ventured into the places most people avoided. And because of this, your work didn't endear you to anyone. While other townspeople were busy with their lives, you were in the dirt, in the shadows, and no one wanted to be anywhere near you. It wasn't just the rats you were avoiding. It was the people. You were a reminder of the unpleasant truths of life, the things people would rather not think about. And it wasn't just the public's perception that made your work tough. The job itself was mentally exhausting. Imagine spending your entire day in the muck, dealing with rats that constantly eluded you, living in conditions that were, by today's standards, unbelievably unsanitary. And the worst part, there was no sense of relief. You never knew if the rats were really under control, or if you were just setting up another trap that would ultimately be ignored or overlooked. It felt like a never-ending cycle, and it was hard not to wonder if you were just a tiny cog in a much bigger, doomed machine. But despite the isolation, the danger, and the stigma, your role was undeniably essential. You were out there every day, protecting the city from the worst of the pestilence and disease that ran rampant in medieval times. Without you, the rats would have run wild, and with them, the fleas that carried deadly illnesses. You were at the front line of public health, though no one wanted to give you credit for it. You weren't just a rat catcher. You were a health worker, a plague fighter, and a keeper of some kind of strange order in a world that often felt like it was on the verge of collapse. And yet, even though your work was crucial, no one saw it. Historians often discuss how essential jobs in medieval times were often given little to no recognition, especially those performed by the lower classes, while the upper classes may have been busy with politics, economics, or war. The survival of the towns rested on the shoulders of people like you, those who worked in the shadows, doing the jobs nobody else wanted to do. But history, for the most part, forgot about you. You were one of the countless invisible workers, never given a voice or a place in the narrative of the time. Instead, your role was relegated to the background, to a footnote in the story of medieval survival. But let's take a moment to consider the unappreciated reality of that work. You were constantly surrounded by filth, disease, and death, and you were necessary. Without you, the plague would have spread faster, the rats would have taken over, and the town would have fallen apart. You were the one who kept things in check, but you were also the one who lived in the dirt, in the muck, unseen and unsung. So why did you keep going? It wasn't for recognition. It wasn't for fame or fortune. No, it was about something else. It was about survival. Your survival, the town's survival. You may not have had a choice in the matter, but that didn't make your work any less important. And in a way, it gave you something that others couldn't have. You were always needed. You were always at the center of something that kept the whole system from falling apart. You were the one who dealt with the things people didn't want to see, and that made you essential. Now, let's step into the day-to-day realities of your work. It wasn't just the rats themselves that you had to deal with. It was the whole process, the setting of traps, the constant vigilance, the endless cleaning and sanitizing. Medieval life was far from comfortable. You lived in a world where public health was a constant concern, and your role as a rat catcher wasn't just a grim task. It was your duty. So how did you go about this essential yet repellent job? How did you survive each day, knowing the dangers that came with it? You didn't have the luxury of high-tech traps, gloves, or safety equipment. No fancy gadgets to catch the rats for you. Just your hands, a spade, and maybe a handful of simple traps. You'd search through every corner of the town, under floors, behind walls, in the dark crevices where rats thrived. The idea of personal protection, much less a germ-free environment, didn't exist. If you got bitten, you could only hope your body would heal. You were exposed to diseases, fleas, and infections every single day, and there wasn't much to protect you from it. other than the simple hope that your experience and perseverance would keep you safe. But here's the thing. While everyone else hid indoors, afraid of the rats and the diseases they carried, you were the one running into the heart of the chaos. Every day, you'd go out into the streets and start your work, chasing rats, laying traps, and cleaning up after them. You could never be sure exactly where they'd be or how bad the infestation was going to get. Maybe one day, the rats had gathered in a small corner of the town, easily managed by a few traps. But on other days, you'd find an entire building overrun, the rats nesting in the walls, the floors covered with droppings. Every day presented a new challenge. That was unpredictable and filled with risk. Historians argue whether this kind of exposure to rats, fleas, and disease contributed to the quick spread of illnesses like the plague. It's clear that you were directly involved in fighting one of the major causes of the medieval health crisis. The rats were the perfect hosts for fleas, which were the real culprits behind the spread of diseases. You were in the trenches, not just catching rats, but fighting the very sources of death that wiped out towns. You were essentially playing a game of cat and mouse. Except the mice were far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The job was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The long hours spent in the muck trying to keep up with an ever-growing rat population were grueling. You worked in the darkness of alleys, the dampness of basements, and the filth of the streets. And while you might have hoped for a little recognition, you knew it was never going to come. People needed you, but they didn't want to see you. Your work was essential, but you were treated as something less than human. It didn't matter how hard you worked, how many rats you caught, or how much risk you took. You were just a tool, a worker, and when the job was done, no one wanted to think about you anymore. And yet, you still kept at it. Every day, you faced the dirt, the stench, and the very real threat of disease. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't a job that made you popular, but you kept going because you knew what was at stake. You understood that without you, the town would be overrun with disease-carrying rats. You were fighting a battle that no one else could see, but one that was vital to the survival of the community. There was no glory in it, no fame. It was just you and the rats, day after day, working tirelessly to make sure the town didn't fall apart under the weight of its own filth. Historians still debate how much the medieval public understood the importance of your work. Did they see you as a hero who kept the town safe? Or did they view you as a necessary evil, something that had to be endured? Like the rats themselves, some claim that people were aware of your importance, but it was still a deeply uncomfortable subject. Others suggest that the social stigma surrounding rat catchers was so intense that even if people knew you were essential, they didn't want to acknowledge it. Either way, the reality was clear. You were doing work that kept the town from collapsing. The rats you hunted were more than just pests. They were disease vectors that could wipe out entire communities. So even though society ignored you, your role was crucial. Without you, the rats would have spread unchecked, and the deadly diseases they carried would have run rampant, killing thousands more. You were the invisible protector of the town's health, but no one saw you that way. Instead, you were the outsider, the figure of discomfort and fear, left alone with your grim task, while the world around you lived in denial of the true dangers. But here's the truth. No matter how unpleasant, no matter how invisible your work was, you were fighting the most dangerous problem medieval towns faced. Without you, the town would have been overrun by rats, plagued by disease, and ravaged by pestilence. You were essential, whether the world saw it or not. As the days and months wear on, you begin to realize something profound about your work. While the townspeople may not want to acknowledge your efforts, you're undeniably a cornerstone of the survival of the community. It's strange, really, how something so banal, so repulsive in the eyes of many, could be so crucial. The rats, the disease, the constant threat of infestation. It's all connected, and in your hands, the delicate balance of life and death in the town is maintained. But here's where it gets complicated. Despite the vital nature of your job, you're still living in the shadows. Society might rely on you to keep the rats in check, but the people, the ones you're doing this for, would rather pretend you're invisible. You're the one working in the muck and filth, dealing with what nobody else can or will, but they're not exactly lining up to thank you. The social distance between you and the rest of the population is ever present. The rich can walk around their clean streets, and the nobility can sit in their castles, blissfully unaware, or at least pretending to be, of the diseases running rampant through the streets. But you're out there in the trenches, making sure that the chaos doesn't overrun everything. And still, you're an afterthought. Historians still debate the stigma surrounding essential workers like you. Some argue that medieval people had a deeply ingrained social hierarchy, one that made certain labor, especially dirty jobs like yours, subservient to those in power. Others suggest that there was at least a grudging respect for what you did, even if people didn't vocalize it. But regardless of what historians think, you know the truth. Your work was not just essential, it was ignored and unappreciated. You could haul rats all day, spend your nights setting traps, and yet people would pass you by with averted eyes, pretending they didn't see the man who kept the streets from becoming a death trap. And that's the hardest part of it all, isn't it? The realization that you're doing a job that no one wants to see, that the work you do is vital, but the recognition is nowhere to be found. Sure, your fellow rat catchers might acknowledge your effort. Maybe, but for the most part, you're just another part of the background, invisible to the people whose lives you're helping to save. If the rats aren't everywhere, if the diseases aren't spreading, then you're forgotten. You're there when you're needed. But the moment things go back to normal, you're cast aside again. But let's face it, there's more to the job than just being a necessary evil. What if, in some twisted way, this work has shaped you into something stronger, than anyone could see. The constant battle against rats, the struggle to stay healthy in a world teeming with disease, the isolation. All of these things have worn you down, yes, but they've also built something up inside you, a resilience, a strength that most people, those who are so quick to judge your work, will never understand. You, the rat catcher, are used to the filth, the danger, and the disregard, and yet you carry on, because that's what you've learned to do, survive the plague, the ever-present risk of disease, and the rat infestation are the most immediate threats to your community, and yet you face them head-on, day after day. It's a strange paradox. The people you're protecting rarely acknowledge you. They're too busy with their own lives to recognize the work you're doing. But that's the thing about essential labor. It doesn't matter how much you're seen. It only matters that you're there when it counts. And when the next wave of illness strikes, when rats spread their fleas, once more, it'll be you who's on the front lines. You'll be there, still working in the shadows, while the rest of the town continues to live their lives, blissfully unaware of the silent battle you're fighting. Historians still question the long-term effects of such a job on the rat catcher's psyche. Some claim that the constant exposure to death, decay, and disease could have led to a sense of hopelessness, even a resignation to fate. Others believe that rat catchers developed a unique mental toughness, a sort of emotional armor, to cope with the daily horrors of the job. Either way, the mental toll is undeniable. Every day is a gamble, every trap a risk, and the constant exposure to disease means you never quite feel safe. But what else can you do? You keep working, you keep going, because that's what survival requires. And in the end, survival is all you can hope for. In some ways, your job is a reflection of medieval life itself, gritty, dangerous, and often ignored. You are a mirror to the world you live in, forgotten, but essential to the functioning of society. Without you, everything would collapse. Yet you remain invisible, never truly acknowledged for the critical role you play. It's a harsh reality, but it's one you've come to accept. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough, because you know that in a world teetering on the brink of disease and destruction, you are the one who keeps things from falling apart. And that, despite the isolation, the stigma, and the danger, gives you a sense of purpose that most people can't even begin to understand. Now, as if the constant work, the physical danger, and the emotional isolation weren't enough, you find yourself fighting yet another challenge. The world around you is changing, albeit slowly, and with it, the nature of your work is starting to evolve. The towns may be rebuilding after the ravages of plague, and the rat populations may be dying down for a time. But as the town grows, so do the risks. The very structures of the town, the increase in trade, the rise in population, all of these things are feeding into the problem that you deal with. With more people comes more waste, and with more waste comes more rats. But the problem goes beyond just the sheer number of rats. You're not just dealing with the pests anymore. You're also facing the growing awareness of disease. You thought the worst was behind you, but as time passes, the very act of catching rats starts to shift. No longer is it just about keeping the streets clear. It's about preventing a potential disaster from unfolding. And you're out there in the muck and grime, holding the line that keeps the whole town from falling back into chaos. Historians still debate whether the medieval understanding of disease really changed after the Black Death, especially in relation to sanitation. Some argue that the events of the plague left a lasting impression on society, leading to gradual improvements in public health and sanitation, while others contend that medieval societies remained largely ignorant to the causes of disease. Either way, the understanding of disease was still primitive by modern standards. You were working in an environment where the knowledge of disease transmission was minimal, yet you were facing the consequences of that ignorance every day. And let's talk about how you were fighting this silent war. The same methods you've used for years, spades, traps, buckets, are still the standard tools of the trade. The idea of protective gear like gloves or even a mask doesn't exist in your world. You're still exposed to the very rats and fleas that bring diseases like the plague. The physical toll this takes on your body is tremendous, but there's another layer to it. The fear of what you might catch. Every time you set a trap or open a pit, you're risking your health and your future. Could this be the time you get infected with something fatal? Could this be the day you bring a deadly disease home to your family? And what about the toll on your mind? You're constantly surrounded by decay, by death, disease, and dirt. You've spent years in the trenches, chasing rats and battling vermin, but no one talks about how that wears on you. The smell, the constant exposure to the worst parts of life, the isolation. It's enough to break anyone, but you've learned to survive in this environment. Maybe, just maybe, you've hardened yourself to it. The constant sense of danger becomes something you learn to live with. The rats, the fleas, the danger of disease, they become a part of the background, something you push to the back of your mind because you have to keep going. Historians argue about the long-term psychological effects of working such grim, essential jobs in the medieval world. Some claim that people in your position, those who worked in the muck, in the shadows, were more likely to experience depression, anxiety, or even a sense of hopelessness, given the isolation and stigma they faced. Others suggest that the sheer necessity of the work, the importance of keeping the town from disaster, gave you a sense of purpose that might have kept you going. But what's clear is that your role wasn't just physically demanding, it was mentally taxing as well. You didn't just fight rats, you fought your own fears, your own sense of worth, as you faced a world that refused to acknowledge your importance. And then, of course, there's the very real danger of becoming a rat yourself. Not literally, of course, but the idea that the constant exposure to the very pests you're hunting could lead to your own downfall. In a world where medical knowledge is limited and treatments for disease are non-existent, the line between a healthy, functioning person and a person stricken by illness is razor thin. Every day you walk that line, knowing that each rat you catch is another potential carrier of death. And every time you reach into that trap, every time you crawl into those dark, filthy spaces where rats thrive, you're putting yourself at risk. But here's the rub. You can't afford to think about it. The job needs doing, and you're the only one who can do it. There's no time for fear, no time for doubt. If you stop, if you hesitate, the rats will win, and the diseases they carry will win too. You've faced the worst, and you've survived. But the job doesn't stop, and neither does the fear. Historians argue whether or not rat catchers truly realized the full extent of the risks they were facing. Some claim that medieval workers were so immersed in their day-to-day lives that they were unaware of the dangers they faced. Others argue that the constant exposure to disease made them keenly aware of the risks. In your case, it seems clear you know what you're up against. But despite the risk, despite the isolation, and despite the constant threat of disease, you keep going. Despite the risks, despite the stigma, and despite the toll it takes on both your body and your mind, you continue your work. Every day you step out the same path, the same tools. The life of a medieval rat catcher might seem monotonous. Catch the rats, set the traps, clean the filth, repeat. But there's a strange sense of inevitability to it. Your job, as thankless and dangerous as it is one of essential importance. And in the face of this grim work, there's a small part of you that takes solace in the fact that you're needed. But what happens when the plague doesn't just remain an occasional threat? What happens when it becomes a constant fear, looming over your daily life like a dark cloud, never quite passing? This is the reality you face. Day in and day out, the Black Death might have passed, but the fear of its return is always with you. As a rat catcher, you are the first to face the threat head on. You're surrounded by the rats, the fleas, the constant threat of disease. And even though the town may rebuild and grow, the fear is there, lurking in every corner, in every dark alley where rats hide. Historians are still divided on whether medieval societies fully grasped the link between rats and disease, or if the real significance of the rat population was overlooked for centuries. Some argue that even in the wake of the Black Death, many towns and cities didn't connect the rats they saw every day with the spread of the plague. Others claim that it wasn't until later outbreaks that towns started to realize the rats weren't just there. They were carriers, active participants in the spread of death. What you know for certain is that every time you handle a rat, every time you enter the dank, dark corners where they thrive, there's a palpable risk. You may be a seasoned worker, used to the squalor, the filth, and the danger, But there's no escaping the fact that the rats are still a danger. The moment you touch a rat, set a trap, or move one of their nests, you're dealing with a biological weapon, one that could trigger another wave of destruction. You've heard the whispers from the townsfolk. What if it happens again? And what if the rats, those same rats you're battling, bring back the plague? It's in these quiet moments, in between the scrabbling and the cleaning, that you begin to feel the weight of your job, the constant uncertainty, the fact that even though you may catch one rat, two more might appear in its place. You'll never be able to stop them all. And even though the work you're doing is vital, essential, and absolutely necessary, it sometimes feels like you're fighting a losing battle. The job is grim. Yes, but the knowledge that you may never truly eradicate the problem, that the rats and their diseases will always be there, lurking in the shadows, is a constant companion. And then there's the issue of the people around you, the ones who depend on you, but never acknowledge you. It's as if they want to pretend that the problem isn't there, that it's something that can be forgotten as soon as it's out of sight. But it's never out of sight for you. You see the rats, you see the filth, you see the danger. And yet, when you return home at the end of the day, you're still invisible to the rest of the town. You're still the person everyone tries to avoid. You're still the rat catcher, the one who deals with the unpleasant, the one who lives in the muck and the shadows. And the worst part is that you don't even expect recognition anymore. Historians have long discussed the psychological toll that working in such grim conditions took on medieval laborers like you. Some suggest that the mental strain of living in a world where death and disease were constant realities led to a certain level of numbness, a kind of emotional armor that workers had to wear just to survive. Others argue that the isolation and the stigma attached to your work led to a deep sense of alienation, one that never quite left. Either way, there's no denying the effect this work had on you. You were exposed to the worst parts of life every day, and it was hard not to be changed by it. But you surveyed. That's what it comes down to. In a world where so many people were wiped out by disease, poverty, and violence, you survived. And even though you were never given the recognition you deserved, even though your role was always seen as unpleasant and lowly, you kept the town from falling apart. You kept the rats at bay. You were, in a sense, one of the unsung heroes of the medieval world. Your work was vital, even though it was invisible. Historians might argue about how much impact your job really had on medieval society. But in the end, your survival, your ability to continue doing the work no one else wanted, was your legacy. The rats, the disease, the filth. None of it could stop you. You kept going because the town needed you, even if no one ever said so. You were the quiet protector, the invisible hero, and in a world that often overlooked your role, you carried on. As time passes, the inevitability of your life as a rat catcher begins to weigh heavier on your shoulders, while the town continues to rebuild and grow. With people moving forward from the trauma of the plague, you're still there, doing the same work day in and day out. You catch rats, you set traps, you manage the city's filthy underbelly, and all the while, you're still invisible. It doesn't matter how essential you are to the town's survival. No one thanks you. No one acknowledges your sacrifice, and the work never stops. As the population grows, so does the problem. The rats multiply. New construction projects disturb their nests. The filth that people discard, whether it's food scraps or waste, becomes the perfect feeding ground for the ever-growing rodent population. The city's expanding sewer systems and the crowding in the streets create even more opportunities for rats to thrive. There's no escape. The rat catchers are trapped in a cycle that's difficult to break. But even more insidious is the mental toll this takes on you. You've seen things that most people would rather ignore. You've lived with the stench, the filth, the constant threat of disease, and the isolation that comes with your job. You're not just hunting rats, you're managing a public health crisis, one that has no end in sight. There's no moment of rest. There's no opportunity for relief. Every day is the same as the last. And in the back of your mind, you wonder how long can this last? Historians still debate whether the rat catchers of medieval times ever truly understood the impact they had on public health. Some argue that these workers were fully aware of their role in preventing disease, while others claim that they, like the general population, had little to no understanding of the link between rats and the plague. Regardless, you're dealing with a situation that is both immediate and life-threatening. You're not just catching rats for the sake of it. You're catching them because they're carrying disease. You're holding back a tide of infection that could wipe out the town in a matter of weeks. In the midst of all this, you find yourself questioning why you do it. What keeps you going? It's not the recognition. It's not the comfort. It's not even the pay, though, that barely covers the cost of your tools, let alone a decent meal. It's the knowledge that your work is, in a strange way, a service to the town. You keep the city from falling into chaos. You prevent the spread of disease. And you make sure that the lives of those around you continue, even if they never realize the sacrifice it takes to make that possible. You may never be acknowledged. You may never be thanked. But in your own quiet way, you understand that your role is crucial to the survival of the city. And that's something that no one else can say. Every day, you walk through the streets, catching rats, setting traps, and cleaning up after the filth of the city. You're the one who makes sure the town remains habitable, even though you live in the margins, ignored by the people you protect. Historians argue whether people like you were truly recognized for the work you did, or if you were just another forgotten worker, overlooked by the upper classes and the general population. Some suggest that your work went unnoticed because society simply didn't want to acknowledge the harsh reality of life. Others believe that, despite the stigma, the town was always secretly grateful for the work of rat catchers. Either way, the reality remains. You kept the city alive, even if you were never given credit for it. As time passes, you begin to think about what your life might have been like if things had been different. What if you had been born into a different family? What if you had been given the opportunity to become a merchant or a scholar, someone who wasn't defined by the smell of rats and the filth of the streets? It's a thought that lingers in your mind, but it's a fleeting one. You know deep down that this is your life now. This is your purpose. However grim it may be, the isolation continues. The work doesn't stop, and yet you endure, because at the end of the day, you're still doing the job that needs to be done. You're still out there, day after day, catching rats, setting traps, and keeping the town from falling apart. And though no one may ever acknowledge it, you know that without you, the city wouldn't survive. You may be invisible, but you're indispensable, and that, in the end, is enough to keep you going. But as the years go by and your work continues, you start to feel the weight of time pressing down on you. The rats may have been your adversaries, but now the constant toil of your life has become the real challenge. Every day, every trap set, every rat caught feels like an echo of the life you've been living. It's not just that the rats continue to breed and spread, though that's certainly a problem in itself. It's that you've become part of the very machinery that keeps the town running. You're in the trenches, so to speak, but you can't help but wonder if there's ever going to be an end to this. Historians still debate whether medieval workers, like rat catchers, ever had a real sense of job satisfaction. Did they feel pride in their work, knowing that they were keeping the town safe from disease? Or did they feel trapped in an endless cycle, doing a job that was necessary, but thankless, one that never seemed to change? Some argue that people in such roles found a strange form of purpose in their work, while others suggest that the lack of recognition and respect for the job led to a deep sense of frustration. Either way, you're the one who keeps things going, and that in itself is a strange form of resilience. You may have spent years in the filth and grime, dealing with rats, disease, and public scorn, but you also understand something important. You've survived, and that survival, despite everything, is a testament to your perseverance. Every time you catch a rat, every time you set a trap, you're one step closer to keeping the town from falling apart. But even as you go about your work, there's a growing realization that you may never see a true end to this. You're not just dealing with rats. You're dealing with the very nature of the medieval world itself, a world where disease and death are always on the horizon, and where your role, while crucial, will never be celebrated. As you continue your daily routine, catching rats and cleaning up after the filth of the town, it starts to dawn on you that this is more than just a job. This is your life. You've become so accustomed to the work, so entrenched in the rhythm of it all, that the thought of leaving or doing something else feels almost impossible. The townspeople may never acknowledge you, but you've come to terms with that. You've learned to accept your role as the one who keeps things from falling apart. the one who faces the grim realities of life head on. But what about the future? What happens when you grow old? When the body that's been exposed to filth and disease finally gives out? You've been living in a world where death and disease are constant companions. Every day is a battle against the things that could end your life. The rats are relentless, and so is the work. Will you be able to continue this for years to come? Will you ever get the opportunity to walk away, to leave behind the stench and the danger, and live a life that's more than just this? These are the questions that start to weigh on your mind. The thought of being stuck in this job forever, of spending your days hunting rats and dealing with filth, becomes more and more unbearable. You begin to wonder if there's any hope for change, for escape from the never-ending cycle. But every day you wake up and go out to do the same thing, because there's no other choice. The rats keep coming, the filth keeps piling up, and you're the one who has to deal with it. Historians still wonder how people in your position, those who worked in the shadows, doing the dirty work of medieval society, coped with the mental strain of the job. Some suggest that the isolation, the stigma, and the constant exposure to disease led to a deep sense of hopelessness and resignation. Others argue that the sheer necessity of the work provided a form of meaning, even in the face of such grim realities. But for you, the truth is clear. Survival is all that matters. The rats will always be there, and you will always be the one to keep them in check. It may not be a glamorous job, and it may never bring you the recognition you deserve, but it's a job that keeps the town alive, and in the end, perhaps that's enough. You've made it this far. After all, you've survived the plague, the rats, the stigma, and the endless, thankless work. And while you may never be remembered or celebrated, you can take some comfort in the knowledge that without you, the town would have fallen apart long ago. As time continues to move on, you begin to realize that, despite everything, you're still in the same position. The rats keep coming back. The streets keep filling with filth. And you're still out there, doing the same job day after day. You're stuck in a cycle, one that doesn't seem to have an end. The town grows and thrives. The people forget about the rats until they appear again, and life goes on. But you remain always on the outskirts, always working in the shadows. You might have hoped that the passing years would bring change. Maybe there was a glimmer of hope that someday this job would be recognized for what it truly was, essential to the survival of the town. Maybe you imagined a day when the people would look at you and say, "Thank you for everything you've done." But that day never comes. The world keeps moving forward, and you stay exactly where you are, in the muck, in the filth, battling rats and disease. Historians still debate whether the work of people like you ever really changed over time. Did medieval rat catchers remain trapped in the same cycle of anonymity and scorn? Or did things improve with the development of sanitation systems and public health measures? Some suggest that over time, The rise of more organized city structures meant that rat catchers were given more tools and resources. Though their social status didn't improve much, others claim that the stigma was so ingrained that it was nearly impossible for workers like you to ever gain recognition. Either way, your life remains the same, essential to the community, but never truly valued. And that's the hardest part, isn't it? The knowledge that no matter how much you do, no matter how many rats you catch, no matter how many diseases you prevent, you will always be invisible. You might spend your days saving lives, preventing pandemics, keeping the town from falling into ruin, but no one will ever see it. They'll never appreciate it. And the moment your work isn't needed, you'll be forgotten. You'll just fade into the background, just another laborer who kept the wheels of society turning, but was never acknowledged for it. Yet, even in the face of this, you keep going. You keep doing the work, because it needs to be done. The rats don't stop, and the dangers they bring don't stop either. The constant threat of disease, the constant cycle of rat infestations is something you have to face every day. The job may never change, and you may never get the recognition you deserve. But without you, the town would fall apart. The work you do is essential, even if no one acknowledges it. And that's where the power of your role lies. It's not about the recognition. It's not about the thanks or the glory. It's about the fact that without you, everything would crumble. The town would be overrun with rats. Disease would spread like wildfire, and the very fabric of society would disintegrate. You are the invisible protector, the unsung hero. You keep the community alive, even though no one sees it. And in the end, maybe that's the most anyone can ask for. Historians argue about the impact that jobs like yours had on medieval society. Some believe that workers like you were the real backbone of society, keeping the towns from falling apart during times of crisis. Others believe that the true power of your work was never fully appreciated, and that the medieval class system made it impossible for anyone in your position to rise above their station. Either way, the reality is clear. You were doing the work that kept society intact. The rats were your enemy, but you were fighting for something much bigger than just a clean town. You were fighting to keep the world from spiraling into chaos, and that fight, no matter how invisible, no matter how thankless, was worth it. Because you kept going, day after day, and the town remained standing. You may not have been celebrated, but you were essential. You were the rat catcher, and the town would have crumbled without you. Over the years, you've come to accept the way things are. The rat infestations never really stop, and neither do you. You're out there, day after day, battling the same battle, facing the same risks. You've become so accustomed to it that, in some ways, you can't imagine life without the work. The rats, the filth, the constant fear of disease. These are the things that have shaped your life, and they are the things that keep you going. But as time passes, there's a part of you that starts to wonder, is there more to life than this? And the work is never ending, and the recognition you so desperately long for never comes. The townspeople continue on with their lives, unaware of the sacrifices you make to keep their world running smoothly. You're always the one on the outside, the one doing the dirty work that no one wants to think about. And while you've learned to live with it, the weight of the loneliness and the isolation starts to take its toll. You find yourself questioning whether this is all there is. You've dedicated your life to something that is necessary, yeah, but it's thankless, exhausting, and isolating. The rats never stop, and neither do you. It's a never-ending cycle that you can't escape. Historians still debate whether medieval workers like you had the chance to change their lives, or if they were stuck in a system that left them trapped in their roles. Some suggest that the rise of towns and trade opened up new opportunities for workers, but for people like you, there wasn't much room for upward mobility. Your job was essential, but it was always considered beneath others. You could never rise above your station, no matter how much you did. And that was the reality you lived with every day. But there's a shift that starts to happen in your mind as you keep going through the motions. You begin to realize that perhaps your work isn't just about survival. Maybe it's about something more. Maybe it's about the small victories. Maybe it's about knowing that even though the world doesn't acknowledge you, you're making a difference. You're keeping people safe. You're fighting against an invisible enemy, and you're doing it day in and day out. The people might not know it, but they need you. Without you, their world would fall apart. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. It's not about the glory or the recognition. It's about doing the work that needs to be done. You might never be celebrated, but you know that without you, the town would fall apart. The rats would take over, the disease would spread, and society would descend into chaos. You are the silent protector, the one who keeps things from collapsing. And while no one ever acknowledges it, you understand the power of your role. Historians still argue whether medieval workers ever truly understood the importance of their roles in society. Some believe that the constant exposure to filth and disease made it impossible for workers like you to appreciate the true value of their work. Others suggest that the sheer necessity of the job, how it kept the town alive, was something that people couldn't ignore, even if they never spoke about it. But in your case, it doesn't matter. You know what your role is, and you know what it means for the survival of the community. The town may forget you, but you are always there, always working, always fighting the rats and the diseases that threaten to take over. Your work might never be celebrated. Your efforts may go unnoticed, but you carry on day after day because you understand the importance of what you do. And in a strange way, that's all you need to keep going. You don't need anyone to tell you you're important. You know it. The years begin to blend together as you keep at it, year after year, hauling rats, setting traps, and cleaning up the mess no one else wants to handle. It's a rhythm, an unbreakable cycle that starts to feel like it's woven into the very fabric of your existence. You wake up, you grab your tools, and you head out to the streets. The same alleys, the same dark corners, the same places where the rats scurry and breed, and yet it feels like the work has no end. You don't have the luxury of thinking about a future that might be different. There's no room for hope. Really not when your job keeps you so entrenched in the muck and filth of the town. You're stuck in a role that seems permanent. Some part of you might have once dreamed of a different life. Maybe a life where you weren't fighting the never-ending tide of rats. A life where your work didn't go unnoticed. But deep down, you've accepted it. You know that without you, the rats would take over, the diseases would spread, and the town would fall apart. And so, you keep going. Historians often debate whether medieval workers like you ever dreamed of escape. Did the rat catchers fantasize about doing something else? Did they yearn for a life free of the stigma and the constant danger? Some historians argue that in a society with little mobility, the very idea of breaking free from one's assigned role was almost impossible. The rigid class structures of the time meant that people were often bound to their anchor station, with little hope of rising above it. Others suggest that, despite this, some workers did manage to find ways to improve their lives, maybe through skill, luck, or sheer determination. But for you, the rat catcher, it's hard to imagine another life. You've been doing this for so long that it's just become you. The thought of changing careers, of stepping out of this grim cycle, is almost unfathomable. You're part of the system now, as much as the rats themselves. But still, there's a flicker of doubt in your mind. Every time you set out to do your job, the question lingers. Is there more to life than this? The work is endless, but it doesn't feel like it's leading anywhere. You're not building a future. You're just maintaining the status quo, keeping the town safe from the threat of rats day after day. It's exhausting. It's dehumanizing. But you keep doing it because it's the only life you know. At some point, you realize that maybe it's not just the rats you're fighting anymore. You're fighting against the very idea of being stuck in a never-ending cycle. The rats are the visible enemy, the ones you can see, the ones you can chase down. But the true battle is against the life you've been forced into. You're fighting against the system that keeps you invisible, the structure that makes sure you're always at the bottom. You're fighting against the idea that your work, no matter how essential, will never be valued. Historians still debate the impact of medieval labor on the psyche of workers. Some suggest that the constant struggle of working in such harsh conditions led to a hardened resilience, while others argue that it created deep-seated frustration and a sense of hopelessness. But you've become accustomed to it. You've learned to accept that this is your life. It's not glamorous. It's not celebrated. But it's necessary. And deep down, maybe that's enough. Because even if the world doesn't see you, you know your work is what keeps the town alive. The rats, after all, are just one part of the problem. You're also fighting disease, decay, and the hidden threats that lurk in the corners of the city. You might not be able to see the disease in the air, but you know it's there. You're surrounded by the very thing that could bring the town to its knees. and you're the one standing in its way. You're the one who deals with the filth, the dirt, the danger, because no one else can or will. Your work might not be recognized, but that doesn't make it any less important. The townspeople don't understand what it takes to do your job. They don't understand the risks, the long hours, or the mental toll it takes, but they need you. Without you, the rats would take over, the disease would spread, and the town would crumble. They can live their lives unaware of the dangers lurking around them because you're out there keeping it all in check. And though you'll never get the acknowledgement you deserve, you've come to realize that maybe that's not what matters. Maybe it's enough to know that you're doing something that's keeping people alive, even if no one ever thanks you, even if no one ever notices. You are the one who keeps the wheels turning. You are the one who keeps the rats and the chaos at bay. And in that, there's a strange sort of power, a strange sort of pride. You don't need recognition. You just need to survive. And so, you do as the years stretch on. A strange stillness begins to settle over your life. The cycles of rats, traps, and filth remain a constant. But something changes in you. The job, the routine, the unrelenting necessity of it all becomes less about survival and more about something else. You've become so familiar with your role in this medieval society that it no longer feels like a choice. It just is. Your place in the world is now as ingrained as the rats themselves, and you begin to wonder whether you could ever imagine life outside this cycle. You've spent years in the trenches, hunting vermin, exposing yourself to disease, risking injury. But why? What for? As you ponder this, it occurs to you that maybe, just maybe, you've become a prisoner of your own life. The work, the isolation, the endless rat catching have slowly consumed you to the point where it seems almost impossible to break free. Sure, the rat population remains a constant problem, but has the problem become you? You start to think about how long you've been performing the same tasks over and over, year after year. It's the same fight, the same struggle, and yet the world keeps turning. The streets are cleaned, the rats are dealt with, and the cycle begins again. Historians still argue about the mental effects of working in such roles. Some say that people in positions like yours, handling vermin and waste, would eventually reach a point of mental fatigue, where the constant exposure to filth and disease led to a sense of resignation and detachment. Others argue that the sheer necessity of your role provided a type of resilience, an emotional callousness, perhaps, that allowed you to keep doing what was required. But you're not sure. You've never had the luxury to stop and think too deeply about it. You've just done it. Every day, you do the work, you fight the rats, and you go home. But when do you get to rest? And it's not just the physical work that weighs on you. It's the knowledge that the world has forgotten your role, that your work will always be hidden in the shadows. You're the one who saves the town from catastrophe. But no one looks at you. They look past you, beyond you. They live their lives, oblivious to the work you do, the risk you take, and the very real danger that surrounds your every movement. And while you've grown accustomed to being invisible, to being a ghost in the background of society, the strain of this invisibility begins to weigh heavily on your spirit. It's strange, really. The more you think about it, the more you realize that the rat catching, the filthy work, the constant exposure to death, it's all become so ingrained in your life that you start to wonder whether the work has defined you. If you stopped, what would you be? Would you even know who you were outside of this job? You've spent so many years fighting the invisible enemy of rats and disease that you no longer know where the work ends. And you begin, and then, in one of those rare moments of clarity, you come to a realization: the job, the loneliness, the thankless labor. It's not just the rats you're fighting anymore. It's everything you've become. You're fighting against the social system that keeps you in place. You're fighting against the idea that your job will never be respected, that no one will ever understand the toll it takes on you, physically and mentally. You're fighting against the very idea that your life has to remain this grim, this shadowy, this unnoticed. But in the end, maybe that's what you've always known. The people you're protecting, they don't understand. They don't know what it takes to keep the town from falling apart, to keep the rats at bay, to ensure the spread of disease is kept in check. And honestly, it's not just them. Society, as a whole, seems to want to forget the grim realities of life. They don't want to think about the filth, the waste, the disease. They just want to go on with their lives, unbothered, untouched by the harshness of the world. So, you keep going. You keep hauling rats. You keep setting traps. You keep fighting the battle that no one else even realizes is happening. Maybe that's what it means to survive in this world, to be the silent worker, the one who does the dirty work, who protects the town without ever being acknowledged. You may not get thanks, you may not get recognition, but you're still the one standing. You're the invisible protector, the rat catcher, the keeper of the peace. Historians argue whether people like you ever fully accepted their roles, or whether there was always an underlying sense of rebellion, a desire to break free from the cycle. Some say the job was a quiet form of defiance, surviving, enduring despite the stigma. Others argue that the grim reality of your work broke you down over time, making you accept your place in the world. Either way, your role hasn't changed. You're still the one in the shadows, doing the dirty work, keeping the rats at bay. But in your heart, you know that your survival, your ability to continue doing this day after day, is what sets you apart. You are the silent backbone of the town's survival. And maybe that's all you need to know. And then, as the seasons shift, you begin to feel something within you start to change. The years of work have left their mark physically, mentally, emotionally, and yet here you are, still standing. You've become so entrenched in the role of the rat catcher that you can hardly remember a time when you didn't identify with the job. But as you grow older, you start to sense the weight of time catching up with you. You realize that even though you've spent your life serving an essential, albeit invisible role, the reality of aging, of your own inevitable decline, becomes unavoidable, and with it, the realization that someday you might not be able to continue this fight. You've grown used to the daily grind, the constant work of setting traps, chasing rats, and keeping the town's population from being overrun by vermin and disease. The physical toll bending, lifting, crawling through the filth has taken its toll on your body. And while you've grown stronger, more resilient, over time, there's no escaping the fact that age catches up with everyone. It may not be the rats that will eventually stop you, but the weight of years that has slowly worn you down. Historians often discuss the mental toll of this kind of labor on medieval workers, particularly those in jobs like yours. Some claim that rat catchers, exposed to disease, filth, and social stigma, were particularly vulnerable to both physical and mental exhaustion. You worked in the shadows, unseen by the rest of society, yet necessary to their survival. In many ways, your role as a rat catcher was emblematic of the invisible labor that supported medieval society. You were essential, but you were also disposable. And as you face the reality of growing older, the question arises: what happens when you can no longer do the work? What happens when your body gives out? For most medieval workers like you, the answer wasn't simple. There were no pensions, no safety nets. Once you were too old to work, you simply became irrelevant. The world didn't make space for those who had become too weak to continue. And for you, the rat catcher, that's a terrifying thought. The idea of becoming invisible in a world that has already disregarded you is the ultimate fear. You have no way of knowing what the future holds. Will someone take your place? Will the town remember your role once you're gone? But you've always known this life would have no easy conclusion. You've seen people come and go, workers who were once in your position, and now you find yourself wondering if the future will hold the same fate for you. The rats never stop coming. The filth never stays away for long. The role of rat catcher, though unpleasant, will always be necessary. And yet, as the years go by, you realize that even the work you've dedicated your life to will eventually fade. New generations will take over the role. New technologies may come to the forefront, but they will never know the world you grew up in. The world that was filled with rats, with disease, with the unacknowledged work that you did. Historians argue about the future of labor in medieval times, particularly after the devastation of the Black Death. Some claim that the depopulation caused by the plague led to a reorganization of the workforce, with new opportunities opening up. Others suggest that, for people like you, little changed. You were always going to be a lowly worker, doing the grim jobs that no one else wanted. But as you look around at the town, bustling and rebuilding, you see signs of progress, of change. Things are improving. slowly but surely. And maybe, just maybe, that's the ultimate hope. The knowledge that even the most invisible roles, even the most necessary tasks, will one day be acknowledged, or at least made less harsh, by time. But for now, you keep going. You wake up, grab your tools, and face another day in the trenches. The rats are still out there. The filth still piles up, and you're still the one to deal with it. You've lived through the worst, and you've survived. You've done your part to keep the town safe. You've kept the cycle going, even though no one ever asked for you to. In some ways, that's the most anyone could ask for. In a world that doesn't stop for anything, and as you go through the motions, one more time, setting traps and catching rats, you know that, for better or worse, your role in this world is something that can never be forgotten, even if the world itself never acknowledges it. The journey of a rat catcher is a journey of survival, of persistence in the face of adversity. It's about doing the work that no one else wants to do, about keeping the wheels of society turning, even when no one notices the strain. You've survived because of this, and in the end, that's all anyone can hope for, because the rats will always be there, but so will you.